The purpose of this presentation is to go over the technical writing style that's required to write a paper at Springfield College. Generally, most of your classes you're going to find that your professors are going to expect an APA-style paper, and to do that, you learn the first requirements of it in this class. APA writing style is a very technical form, it's very prescribed, and you really have to stick to the rule. So, a couple of things before we get into the really nitty-gritty of the technical writing style. First, you want to make sure when you write your paper that you seek continuity. What I mean here is don't lose your reader. Remember, I am not a content expert, and even if I was, when I read something, I want to make sure that your ideas fully come across. So you want to make sure that you always introduce, discuss, then conclude. That's why that's why your section is expected to be that lovely funnel where you have an intro, content, and then conclusion. Also, you want to make sure that you use transitions. If you are describing a couple of studies in your section, 3, 4, 5 studies, you don't want to just say, in this study they did this, in this study they did this, in this study they did this. You want to make sure that you include links or transitions between your paragraphs and sources so I know why that you connected them all together in your head. You organize them to be in the same section and to follow each other for a reason, but you have to make sure that comes across in your paper. Make sure that you strive for what's called economy of expression or parsimony. Essentially, don't be fancy, just tell me exactly what needs to be said and move on. Avoid jargon, avoid lengthy prose. It's natural sometimes, especially if you come from a more English background, to really want to write kind of largely. Here, it's a more direct writing style is appropriate. So instead of saying something like a total of 68 participants, it's better to write participants and then in parentheses n equals 68. It's a quicker way of saying something. Ideally, what you want to think of is short words, short sentences, short paragraphs. So avoid paragraphs that are longer than a page, but make sure all paragraphs are at least three sentences. And that is a Springfield College requirement. Every paragraph must be at minimum 3 sentences. Also avoid sentences that are longer than 4 typed lines. If they're longer than 4 typed lines, while this is not definite, it's most likely that you have a run-on sentence, so you have a grammar issue. Also, make sure that you avoid redundancy. Don't tell me the same thing over and over and over again, other than when you introduce, discuss, and conclude. But in your discussion, you should be able to just make your point and move on. Make sure that when you say what you mean, your word choice is very purposeful. Avoid any sort of colloquialisms that don't give me a lot of information. When you tell me a large part, very few, a lot, there's not really anything that I can quantify from there. And the way I interpret very few might be different than how somebody else interprets very few. So instead, be very specific in the terminology you use. Avoid non-scientific words such as believe, felt, looked at, have shown. Instead, use words like investigated, determined, reviewed, examined. These are all stronger scientific terminology. Again, not to be redundant, avoid redundancy. Since your review of literature is all about sources in the past, we're going to expect that you're going to use an active voice but a past tense, because what you're doing is you're describing things that have been done in the past. So in terms of the active voice, instead of saying something along the lines of research designed by so-and-so used so-and-so, here, Jones designed the research too, or you can be even shorter and say Jones investigated and tell me exactly what Jones investigated. Option number 3 is your best option. And since your review of literature is all about studies published before today, you're going to use past tense for the review of lit. There are very, very few places or exceptions where you can use present tense where it's an ongoing situation. But here, Jones investigated, Smith reported, Coughlin stated. You can see how these are all in past tense, and you will be graded on using past tense. Now, personification is a really nitpicky rule. What it says in the APA manual is to use personification sparingly. The way that Springfield has chosen to interpret this rule is to avoid personification altogether. So when we avoid personification, what we're going to do is remove any sort of use of it. What it is giving human properties to objects. For example, the results revealed. Well, actually, the results didn't do anything. Instead, a researcher conducted a series of statistical analysis, and the researchers revealed the following results. It's an important distinction because we really don't want to we want to make sure credit is given where credit is due. Again, instead of saying the study described, you can say the research described, or instead eliminate the beginning of sentence. So instead of saying, if the paper says the study described that vertical jump is related to power in soccer, then you could actually just, instead of saying the study described, remove that altogether and just say vertical jump is related to power in soccer. It is a shorter sentence, it's more direct, it's more active. Now, for assignment 2, I want you to try to edit out your personification, but you won't lose points for it. Instead, I just make comments because most of you haven't had to edit for personification before. Instead, you'll have to make sure you make those changes for your final paper. Here are a couple of other requirements that you're going to have to make sure you avoid. Avoid all possessives. Instead of saying the boy's heart rate, it's the heart rate of the boy. The very few situations where you can use a possessive is if you can't write around it. For example, you could not paraphrase the word women's track and field. That is a term, you can't do anything about it. It is the name of the sport. But otherwise, anything his, hers, their, anything with an apostrophe S. Also, you need to get rid of pronouns. So you want to use the find function for it, this, and there, and make sure that they're all out of your paper. Again, each one of those is worth 1/4 of a point, so I make sure that you knock them out. You aren't allowed to use a contraction, any sort of form of contraction, so what I encourage people to do is to use the find function for apostrophes. That'll help you both with looking for possessives and contractions and editing your paper. Don't end a sentence with a preposition, such as to, on, upon, etc. And then don't reference yourself in any way. Don't talk about I, don't talk about I think, the researcher thinks. You're not involved here. What you're doing in this paper is to talk about what other people did. A couple of basic requirements. Like I said earlier, all paragraphs have to have a minimum of 3 sentences. I'll be checking for those. If they don't, that's going to be points. When you make your structure or sentences, make sure you have complete sentences. I know that seems like a silly comment to make to grad students. However, when you're juggling as many sources as you'll be juggling and writing as much as you do, you'll end up finding that you're going to jump around in your paper and you're going to forget to complete a sentence. It happens all the time. Make sure you watch for it. Again, avoid run-on sentences and make sure you review your paper for anything that reads awkwardly. That happens a lot when people are trying to avoid personification or remove pronouns. Often the sentence comes out awkwardly, so you need to make sure you edit it in a way that it makes sense. Run spell check, but remember, spell check is not perfect. Trial, or you could be meaning to say trial, but you instead spell trail, and it wouldn't be picked up. However, you're in grad school, and there's no excuse for any spelling errors. Now, here's more of the APA documentation. We need to make sure that, except for your hypotheses, some of your critical analysis, pretty much your entire paper should be documented because it's going to come from other sources. So you need to make sure you use citations to avoid plagiarism. I don't want you quoting in this paper. You're not allowed to use any quotations, but you are going to be paraphrasing other people's work. And when you paraphrase other people's work, you are required to cite them. So when you cite them, here's what you're going to do. List the author or authors and the year as a part of the sentence. So you can say, Coughlin stated that. Notice when I read that aloud, grammatically, I just ignore whatever's in parentheses. So anything that is in parentheses shouldn't be part of the grammatical sentence. Coughlin is the noun, stated is the verb, Coughlin stated that, Listing several, you can list authors in parentheses and you can list more than one. So several researchers reported, notice how again grammatically I ignored everything in parentheses, but in parentheses I list who those several researchers are. Archer, Barnett, and Stanisek, Coughlin, Hollingsworth. Again, another thing to note is how the authors are organized. When we organize the authors, we organize them in order, alphabetical order by first author. So we have Archer, Barnett, Coughlin, Hollingsworth. In general, you want to provide the documentation prior to the discussion of the paraphrasing so that I know where the origin of the statements is coming from, and where possible, make sure that it's clear that you're linking the author to your discussion. For this paper, again, you're not allowed to do any quotations. You're going to practice paraphrasing. Next paper, you'll be allowed to do some quotations as necessary, but really in APA, you're not supposed to quote very often. Continuing on this idea of citation, many researchers use what's called a block style. I'm just going to move this up to the corner here. What a block style does is it implies that you open a paragraph, so let's say this is my paragraph, with a citation. So maybe you cite the author at the beginning of this sentence. Then you're going to continue to discuss information by that author throughout the paragraph, and then at the end of the paragraph, you're going to cite them somewhere. Maybe you do a parenthetical citation or you do an in-text citation. One thing you should know, though, is that, and what this tells me, is that everything in between those two citations comes from the same author. But citations do not carry over paragraphs or block cites. So what you need to do is you need to cite at the beginning and end of every paragraph, even if it's the same author and you're just talking about the same source for multiple paragraphs. You need to block cite each paragraph. Block citing is a great way to avoid putting lots and lots of the same citation over and over in the same paragraph. Other things that you should work on avoiding, avoid generalizations. If you do make a generalization, make sure that you document at least 3 sources to support that generalization. So instead of saying researchers concluded that and giving no informations, tell me several researchers have stated that, and then notice how I have Jones, King, and Smith. And again, I have them in alphabetical order by first author, and I put in a semicolon between each citation. As you go through, make sure you check the bibliography, or the bibliographic chain. Make sure that your sources match. Other people, when they read your thesis, makes it into the library or your dissertation, they want to be looking for your sources. You want to make sure that everything is accurate. This is down to any sort of accents on the letters. The years that the publications are all correct. This is all critical information. The spelling of the last name. Make sure you get these to match correctly. If you reference Coughlin 1984 in your text, then there should be a Coughlin 1984 in your bibliography. Again, spelling should be correct, years should match, the order of the author should match, and the order of the author should be based on the order that's presented in the paper, because that order is meaningful. The person who is listed first always does the most amount of work, and then it continues on towards the end. Make sure you cross-check to your bibliography, because I'll be cross-checking to your bibliography and deducting points where you don't match. Now, one of the ways to make your life easier, you're going to start to see that sources have, I'm going to enlarge this a little, sources have more than 2 or 3 authors, and then it becomes a pain to write them all out. So when a source has multiple authors, there can be ways that you can abbreviate it, and the abbreviation that we use is et al. Et al., the ET is the French word for and, so there's no period, where al is a Latin abbreviation for other individuals. So here, the APA guidelines used for et al. When we have 2 authors, we always cite both authors. So if there's only two people, Smith and Coughlin, you're always going to say Smith and Coughlin. If you have 3 to 5 researchers, the first time you're going to list all of the researchers. Then, other times you can use just the first researcher's name and et al. So notice here, I have Smith et al. 1996 for a parenthetical citation, and I have Smith et al. And then in parentheses 1996 for an in-text citation. With 6 or more researchers, this is just so many researchers that they only make you write the first researcher from the very beginning. So throughout the entire paper, I would only expect you to write, if there's 6 authors, or 6 or more authors, Smith et al. 1996. This is more common in medical field, exercise physiology, and so on, not as common in our other fields. Again, notice the et does not have a period, the all does. Make sure you do that appropriately. Make sure you check the use of et al. Against your bibliography. Now, another place that you're going to have, if you're citing only 2 authors, or the first time you're citing 3 to 5 authors, make sure that you don't use first names or initials. That's for anybody. Don't use and between surnames of multiple authors. So use and. So here what we have, Smith and Jones found that. Now, that's when it's in text or in the sentence. However, if it's in parentheses, again, you're still not going to use names or initials, but you're going to use the ampersand instead of the word A and D. So several researchers, Baker, White, ampersand Johnson, semicolon, Jefferson, ampersand Lincoln, 2000, semicolon, Smith, ampersand Jones, comma, 1999. Notice again, alphabetical order by first author, Baker, Baker, Jefferson, Smith, and notice the use of the ampersands. Couple of punctuation guidelines. A period is found at the end of a sentence. A period and all other forms of terminal punctuation, such as a question mark or an exclamation point, should be followed by 2 spaces in APA. I know some of you have been brought up on period space, some of you have been brought up on period space space. APA requires period space space in 6th edition. A comma is found between elements in a series of 3 or more. A comma should be placed before or after the and or the or. Again, some of you have not been brought up in this way, but you need to know it for RAPA. So Jones measured self-confidence, comma, motivation, comma, and state anxiety. Should also be used to set off non-essential clauses, such as before beginning the sentence, comma, the researcher should, blah, blah, blah. A comma should be used to separate 2 independent clauses joined by conjunctions and should be used to set off dates. Those are your regular comma rules. And then finally, headings. Headings are listed on page 62 of the APA manual. Most of you are only going to be doing level 1 headings. These are centered, bold, capitalize the first letter of each important word. A level 2 heading is common in a method section where you have subsections. It is sometimes more common in dissertation reviews of literature. This is a left line, bold, capitalize the first letter of each important word. A level 3 header is indented, bold, initial cap only. It does not happen very often. Alright, that's the end of your technical writing section. Remember, this is not all of the APA rules. You need to refer to the APA manual. Things like looking up numbers or rules for numbers, or really making sure you understand the difference between a parenthetical citation or an in-sentence, in-text citation. Make sure that you become very good friends with your APA manual so that you have that information. This is just the key points. All right? You can go back and edit your paper now.